You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, Colin here. As you can probably tell by the title of this episode, we are going to be talking about abortion. We're going to discuss a Christian perspective on it, as well as the Bible's various messages regarding the topic. So if abortion is a sensitive subject for you for one reason or another, just realize that is going to be the whole of this episode. I'm going to do my best not to be crass or overly descriptive in this episode, but I do realize that abortion is a very sensitive subject, and so there may be some of you listening where, for whatever reason, you just don't feel comfortable with listening to a whole episode on that right now, and I want you to know that is totally okay. No hard feelings. What is most important is that you take care of yourself and that you are in a place where the resources that you are listening to and reading are helpful for you. The point of this podcast is always to be a help. And so if you're listening to this and you find it discouraging or triggering or what have you, completely okay to stop and either come back another time or just pick up on a different episode. All right, just wanted to get that out of the way up front. Love all of you. Glad you're on this journey with us, whether you're here for this episode or you choose another one. Okay? Let's get to it.
Abortion is a cancer in our culture today. I would argue that it's actually a sign of God's judgment upon us already.
Because you come to Mars Hill Church with blood-soaked hands. You wanted sex and not marriage. You wanted sex and not children. And you are accessories to murder.
Mothers and fathers inside Planned Parenthood, I know you can hear my voice. I'm calling out to you, begging you not to kill your own children. You are already mothers and fathers, and nothing will ever change that. The only difference is whether you will walk out of here the mother and father of a living child or a dead child. Planned Parenthood dismembers small children.
Headed for judgment in a sea of blood for the murder of babies, along with all the other perversions that go with it. And I don't think that anything shows more clearly the moral collapse of a society than the mass murder of little ones in the wombs of mothers.
Abortion is murder, and it's a holocaust like the world has yet to see. In fact, just to put it in perspective, Stalin was guilty of murdering 40 million of his own countrymen, Hitler 30 million human beings, and the United States, since Roe versus Wade, not globally, but the United States, has blown past both of those brothers and have made them look angelic as we have slaughtered wholesale 55 million little boys and little girls.
Man, we like to go for the easy topics first thing in the morning on Sunday, don't we? Abortion. We're discussing it because this is a very real world issue, and like any real world issue, it is not as black and white as we like to present it as being. So right up front, I want to go ahead and give some guiding principles for this study. All right, and there's quite a few here because it's a complex topic. So I tried to narrow these down, and the best I could narrow it down to was 10 principles that we need to consider before going into an actual study of what the Bible says regarding abortion. Here's our first thing to keep in mind. Number one, be respectful of other people's opinions and beliefs. All right, good Christians can disagree on this and still be both good and Christian. Abortion hits that perfect storm of being right in between theology and politics, two things that you're never supposed to discuss at the dinner table, right? And so when you have a topic like that just merges those two fields, you have the Venn diagram of theology and philosophy, and abortion sits right in the middle, you are guaranteed to get tempers flaring fast. And it's really easy for people on both sides of this issue to dehumanize the other side. But we have to remember that the other side is made up of human beings too. Regardless of which side of the debate you are coming from listening in on this now, or if you even have an opinion on it, we need to treat other human beings, like the images of God that they are, whether we agree with their position or not. Conservatives aren't all a bunch of controlling patriarchy pawns that just want to tell women what to do. And progressives aren't a bunch of baby murderers. Right? Both sides are made up of good, intelligent people who are trying to love others as best they can within the confines of their own views. I realize that might be hard to see from within your own perspective, so hopefully what we're going to be able to do today is show this from more than one angle so that we're able to see the humans on the other side of the debate. Remember, so much of this is made to be about life and whether or not the fetus or the baby is alive. But we can't miss the other lives on the other side of the aisle as well. There is more to this issue than just the baby. There's also the mother. There's also the person on the other side of the aisle from you on this debate. So in your rush to defend a life, don't miss the other lives around you. We have to keep that front and center in this topic. So if there is any point in this where you start to feel the emotions rising and you want to lash out at someone else, just pause, take a deep breath, and realize that there is another human being in front of you who has the beliefs that they have for a reason. Even if they don't make sense to you, even if they are not the ones that you have, there is a reason that everybody believes what they believe. And so rather than just attacking someone who appears to be on the opposite side of an issue from you, maybe we can try to get to the why, try to get down to what are we actually talking about here, and are we even coming at this because of the same issues. Maybe one person's coming at it from one side because of one issue that they're stressing, and the other side is coming at it from an issue that they're stressing, and so they just end up talking over each other. So that's another thing I want to do with this study, is be able to get down to the core motivations of why someone is going to take one position over another. And with that, I want to side note too, that everyone can bring a different perspective to this conversation. Everyone is welcome to this conversation. There are a lot of men who will bow out of the abortion debate out of respect for the fact that it doesn't affect them nearly as much as it does women. And that is true. But silencing anyone in this issue just perpetuates the harm that has been done throughout history. Rather than requiring men to be silent on this issue, we should invite everyone to the table and be equally respectful of all. Now, I do understand why some men try to back out here, because a lot of legislation and honestly the whole abortion debate has been mostly taken over by men throughout history. So it's kind of like saying, hey, we've talked too long, now we want to give you a chance to talk. And there is validity to that. But we don't want to overcorrect to where we think that just because someone is not biologically able to have a child, that therefore means that they have no say in this. Think for a second about another major debate that we have going on in our country today: gun control and violence, right? Imagine saying that the only people who should get a say in what gun laws are written are the people who own guns. I realize that's not a perfect analogy, but I think it helps to get across the point that cutting someone out of an issue is not a way to get to a resolution to that issue. The more voices we're able to listen to, the more we're able to learn and understand each other and come to a more nuanced position. And just like this shouldn't be a whole bunch of men just talking about what they think regarding abortion, it also shouldn't be something where an entire gender just drops out of the conversation. We need to be willing to listen to each other and be equally respectful of all here. Now, that being said, you might question then why I, alone as a guy, am talking about this here on the podcast. I did that purposefully here. And that's because when we do these episodes of the Bible Distilled, where we're doing a systematic theology, where we're distilling down the Bible's various messages on a given topic, I'm not trying to convince someone of any one position. I'm also not necessarily trying to share a bunch of stories or personal experiences regarding that topic. My area of expertise is the Bible and its ancient Near Eastern culture. So that's what we're looking to focus on, and I don't want anyone to be able to say, oh, you're just trying to share a bunch of stories to emotionally manipulate someone on this issue one way or the other. No, I just want to take the area that I'm good at, which is the Bible and its culture, and try to bring that into our current conversations so that we can remove the ways that we have misused the Bible on both sides of the aisle here. There is a place for episodes that debate between two sides, or for articles that just tell stories of people's experience with abortion. And, I've even linked to some of those on our episode page for this. That stuff already exists. And I mean, I realize people have talked about abortion in the Bible plenty as well, so this kind of exists too. But I'm hoping to bring a little bit of a different angle to this than maybe you've heard before. All right, point 2. Try to read the Bible like an ancient Israelite, not a 21st century American. This means that we do not impose in our own cultural context. The biblical authors were under no obligation to address the hot-button issues of modern-day America. They wrote about what mattered to them in their time and their place, and we need to respect that without changing their message to try to force it into our context. And that's what I'm afraid too much preaching does. It says, I have this hot button issue that I want to rant on this week. What Bible verses can I find that mention something along those lines? And then they just string a bunch of Bible verses together and call it a day and think that they've made a point. That is not good preaching. I do believe the Bible is relevant for today. I do believe it can speak into this issue. I mean, heck, I have a podcast about it, and we're doing an episode about abortion. So obviously, I think it is relevant, but not always in the same way that it gets preached to be. I want to put the Bible in its original context at the forefront. That, in my mind, has to be primary to our discussion, because anything else, we're just making the Bible say whatever we want. So just realize that the Bible may not actually be as clear on, well, any given issue as you think it is. Again, that doesn't mean the Bible can't speak to the stuff we're concerned about today, but it means that neither God, nor the Bible, nor the biblical authors were obliged or obligated to check off a list of boxes of key topics that 21st century Americans are getting up in arms about. Third point, once we do get into some Bible verses here, we have to remember that a statement is different than a command. Not every part of the Bible is prescriptive. There's a good bit of it that is descriptive. And there is no command in all of Scripture, Genesis to Revelation, that requires thou shalt outlaw all abortions. We can use passages that aren't prescriptive in our discussion, but we must allow this reality to soften the tone with which we speak to those on the other side. I can already sense the fists clenching over what I just said. So just take a second, unclench whatever it is that is clenched, take a deep breath. Remember, I am not trying to tell you that the Bible is irrelevant for this topic, or that you can't believe what you believe. I am saying that we need to be careful not to misrepresent the Bible or put words in God's mouth that aren't there. A lot of the preaching on this particular issue is a string of assumptions put together as one simple, obvious statement, when maybe it's actually not that obvious. So those stones that you were about to pick up to throw at me, set them back down and hold off your judgment until the end of the episode. Then you can stone me, all right? Point 4. Consistency is key. Much of our modern abortion debate is really just political posturing that often goes out the window when circumstances slightly change. I've linked to an article on our page for this episode that is just story after story of people who had worked in abortion clinics, and they saw people who would picket outside the clinics, saying that abortion is murder and you can just give your child up for adoption or keep your child, whatever, that sort of thing. And then those very same people end up going into the clinic at some point for an abortion, being super secretive about it, and they're nasty to the staff, get their abortion, and then walk out and they're back picketing the next day. I understand we like to keep our assumed moral high ground, and we all like to think that we're the exception to whatever rule. But if you have a view, you should as much as possible strive to be consistent on it. And if something happens that forces you to change your view a little bit, be honest about it. Don't try to just hold up appearances. As much as possible, we should strive for consistency in how we apply our views. Number 5. Pretty much all of the terms in this debate are very misleading and unhelpful. Pro-life and pro-choice are awful terms to describe two different sides of this debate. Everyone is both for life in general and for choice in general. There is no anti-life side. There is no anti-choice side. There are situations where everyone would choose to save a life. And there are situations where everyone would choose to take a life if they absolutely had to. There are situations where everyone would favor autonomy, And there are situations where anyone would favor legal restrictions on certain actions. It's not that people who argue for abortion hate life, and that people who argue against abortion hate women or hate autonomy or choice. No, you know what? Those are just horrible marketing terms. I would prefer to use the terms pro-abolition of abortion and anti-abolition of abortion. So the pro-life side would be pro-abolition of abortion. They want to get rid of abortion. And the pro-choice side would be anti-abolition of abortion. They're against that. I realize those terms are just as subject to difficulty, and they are extremely clunky. You know, I want to use those terms in this episode. I'm probably going to slip up and say pro-life or pro-choice just because, you know, that's in the vernacular and it's so much easier. But I'm going to try to say pro-abolition for pro-life and anti-abolition for pro-choice, just because the unfamiliarity of those terms should help us to view the matter afresh, and it's more honest to the issue. And those aren't the only problematic terms either. You ever notice how when a mother wants to keep the baby, they refer to it as a baby, and when they don't want to keep it, they refer to it as a fetus? And there are certainly exceptions, but you can see how those terms bring with them so much assumed baggage just by hearing them. Someone on a pro-abolition side is going to hear the word fetus and they're going to recoil. Someone on a anti-abolition side might hear the term baby for a baby in the womb and bristle a little bit. Now, there's a lady who's written on this issue, and I linked to some of her stuff in the episode notes, Rebecca Todd Peters. She used the term prenate in her discussion of the topic, because anything after birth would be postnatal. So a prenate is a very technical term for the being in the womb. And I want to try to adopt that here. Again, I may slip up just because of how common the terms are. And honestly, I do not expect anyone else to adopt such an unwieldy term. But again, I think the unfamiliarity of those terms should help us to view the matter afresh. All right, number 6. And this one is important, especially if you came from a very anti-abortion side like I did growing up in church. You need to hear this. Nobody actually wants to go around constantly having abortions. There is no such thing as a pro-abortion side. Nobody is out there saying, oh, I want all abortions all the time, no restrictions, no questions asked. If you believe that's what this debate is about, you have been sold a very inaccurate description of the other side. There is no one who is actually for abortion all of the time. The issue is more so just whether or not it is allowed in certain cases. Even when fully legalized, abortion is still, for the vast majority of people, a last resort, not a first choice. So please keep that in mind as we move forward here. 7. Prohibition of anything never brings lasting change. It only drives the now taboo behavior underground. Think about actual prohibition in America when alcohol was outlawed. Did that stop people from drinking? Heck no. And it just raised the crime rate. It was an extremely unsuccessful experiment. And all you have to do to figure this out is look at any sign that says, wet paint, do not touch. Were you going to touch that before you saw the sign? Probably not. Do you want to now that you have seen the sign? More than likely. Prohibiting something never brings lasting change. It just forces that behavior underground. The number of abortions, get this, the number of abortions that happen when abortion is outlawed are about the same as the number that happen when it's legalized. Legislation on abortion does next to nothing on lowering the number of abortions. What it actually just does is raises the rate of abortion-related complications that occur. So if you think that creating some law to ban abortions or more greatly restrict abortions is the answer, what you are really settling for is roughly the same number of abortions and a far greater risk of women being injured or contracting illnesses from the abortions that they are inevitably going to have, but have to have underground now. Remember, if you are going to label yourself as pro-life or try to say that you are about life, it can't just be about the life of one baby. It also has to be about life in general. It has to be about the life of the mother. You have to consider the ramifications of everything here. And I realize that so many people just want the simple answer of if we pass a law, it's going to fix things. That's not the way it works. Laws don't change issues. Laws don't change hearts. They just make it easier or harder to do what people are already going to do. I'm not by any means saying we should abolish all laws and have no laws in our government whatsoever. I am not a proponent of complete anarchy. But I am saying that if we are turning to political legislation as the answer to this issue, we are severely missing the point. And that brings me to my next point. In a democracy like America, there can be and often is a difference between what I personally believe and what should be legislated for everyone. Christians, please understand this, especially with an election about to come up. And I realize I try not to be very political on this podcast. We have listeners on all sides of the spectrum here. But this is something I really wish more Christians would understand. It is completely okay to have your own beliefs. And it's understandable that you might wish more people followed your beliefs. I mean, you hold your beliefs for a particular reason, right? And you think it's the best belief system to have. I mean, that's why you hold it. So of course you would think if other people believe this too, their lives would be better. But there's a difference between religion and politics. And there's a reason we have a separation of church and state in our country. If you try to take your religious beliefs and force them on everybody else through legislation, that is not the American way. That is basically creating a state church. I realize this is a whole other issue right now with Christian nationalism and the place that Christianity has in government and what part our religious beliefs should have in legislation and Christians as politicians and all of that. That's a whole other discussion for another day. But let me just say this. Realize, Christian, if you push for your specific belief system to be favored in government, to become the new legislation, that may be nice for you for a little while the current government follows your same belief system. But all that you have actually done is set a precedent for the next regime to come in that does not agree with you and to do the same thing with their belief systems. So imagine for a second if somebody with a completely antithetical system of beliefs to you, like the exact opposite of what you believe. All of their values are completely counter to what you believe. Imagine if that was the system of government in America right now. And I realize some of you are probably thinking, oh yeah, it is. All right, yeah, just go with the analogy here. If that were the case, how would you feel about having to live under them if they made every law about their belief system being the way that it had to be? You would say that's anti-American. We're not supposed to favor one view over another. We're supposed to allow for multiple representation. We're supposed to allow for diversity of beliefs and practice and all that. Exactly. So if you don't want that for somebody else's belief system being put over you, realize that you can't do that over them either. And I'm not saying that your religious beliefs can't affect how you vote. Obviously, they are going to. But be careful not to use your vote to establish a government made up of your exact belief system, because that is setting a dangerous precedent for the next group to come in that has a different belief system and do to you what you did to them. There is a difference between what I personally believe and what I believe should be legislated for everyone. There are times where I have to step back and say, yep, I would love it if everybody lived this way. But not everybody does. So out of respect for them and out of respect for the fact that we live in a democracy, not a theocracy, I have to vote for freedom for all so that I can keep freedom for myself as well. Point 9. This is where we're going to get into the crux of what we're going to talk about for a good bit here. As long as one side stresses the initiation of life as the most important thing, and that's going to be the pro-life side, the pro-abolition of abortion side, and the other side stresses the importance of autonomy first and foremost, no fruitful conversation will occur. And this is what happens so much is we just end up talking over each other because the pro-choice side, the anti-abolition of abortion side, is there saying, we don't want you telling women what they can do. Their autonomy is important. But since the other side is focusing on life and saying abortion is murder of a human life, they're not going to listen to somebody talking about autonomy. They're going to say that the issue of murder trumps that. So the current talking points aren't getting us anywhere. No fruitful conversation is occurring that way. The core question, I believe, then becomes the matter of when personhood begins. And I think that helps us to look at this from a slightly different angle and hopefully get to a point where even if we don't all agree, we can better understand where we're all coming from. So we're going to focus on that in just a second. But last but not least, I have to get one more point in here. And that is, what drives women to get abortions is more important than the abortion itself. If the church and the home will begin to teach a holistic and realistic view of sex and actually provide care and resources rather than judgment and shame to those in need, fewer abortions would happen. And remember what I said a few minutes ago. There is no all for abortion side. Nobody is completely pro-abortion. Nobody actually wants people to constantly get abortions. We all would love to see fewer abortions happen. Even those on a pro-choice side would like to have fewer abortions happen. But that is not going to happen until we present, both as churches and as homes, parents, please present a more holistic and realistic view of sex and provide care, resources, love, over judgment and shame. The reason that so many abortions happen is because there are so many young women who are not taught anything about sex, and often that's in Christian homes. The number of stories I have heard of teenage girls in youth groups who were extremely anti-abortion, and then they're messing around with their boyfriend and their period comes a little late and they freak out and they think, I have to go get an abortion. That is the first thing that crosses their mind. You know why? Because they know that their parents can't be trusted with that information without absolutely freaking out. You know why? Because they realize that they might have to get up in front of their entire church congregation and admit to a bunch of people that barely know her what happened. And you know what ends up happening in a lot of those situations too? Is the girl doesn't even end up being pregnant. She was just a little late that month. But because she was not given a proper amount of sexual education, she thought that was the only option. And look, I get it. Nobody likes to talk to their kids about sex. Or to their parents about it, for that matter. But I went to Bible college, right? And the amount of not even teenagers at that point. We're talking about early 20s, kids about to get married, kids who just got married, and they still did not understand how sex and pregnancy worked. It's insane. And that is a horrible, horrible testimony of how the church in America today has chickened out of difficult conversations so that they didn't have to feel embarrassed about talking about a hard subject, or sometimes just because they were too lazy to actually put in the work and find out those things for themselves. I realize in the situation I gave, some of you are there thinking, well, the problem is that she was messing around with her boyfriend in the first place, and so it's all her fault anyway. You know what? We're going to get to that toward the end of the episode here. But can I just say that we need to focus on showing grace and love in a time like that, especially if it's with a teenage girl. We need to show so much grace and love because the stuff that she's going to be feeling at that point is so much shame and judgment on her own. She doesn't need you adding that on. I've said it at least twice now. I'm probably going to say it a bunch more times in this episode. If you claim to be pro-life, it can't just be about the theoretical life inside the womb. It has to be about life in general, and that includes the person who is pregnant, whether you agree with how they got into that situation or not. They're there, you're there with them. Help the situation. Don't cause more hurt, please. Okay, now that I got that mini rant over, time to move into defining some terms and thinking a little bit outside of the box. I am not a medical doctor of any sort, but I think it's worth just giving a little bit of a defining of abortion because I don't know where everyone listening to this is, and there may be some people who aren't actually familiar with what exactly an abortion is. Abortion, in the simplest terms, is ending a pregnancy. It can occur naturally, leading to a miscarriage. Technically, When a mother miscarries, that can be called a spontaneous abortion. Her body aborted that baby. And that's not saying anything about her or the child. It can be for any number of reasons. But abortion, in the terms that we're talking about today, can happen either by medication or surgery. There are some pills that can be used to induce an abortion within roughly 3 months of a woman's last period. And they're taken a couple of times, and it forces a miscarriage. Surgical abortions can take place up to roughly around halfway through the second trimester, which is around halfway through the pregnancy. Average pregnancy is going to be about 9 months, broken up usually into 3 trimesters, 3 periods of 3 months each. So most of the time you are not going to hear about an abortion past the halfway point of the pregnancy unless there was some sort of medical emergency that required it to save the mother's life. In any of those situations, since the embryo still has to leave the mother's body in some way, there is going to be some pain and discomfort in any abortion. That being said, the actual abortion is usually relatively quick, and the process as a whole only takes a few days to complete. Complications are honestly not as common as are often presented, but counseling is recommended both before and after an abortion. As you can probably guess, if you have listened to this podcast any length of time, knowing that I grew up very conservative, independent, fundamental Baptist, all I ever heard was extreme anti-abortion rhetoric. Now, I never had the experience of picketing at an abortion clinic or anything like that. I have definitely known people who have. We've been adjacent to those circles of fundamentalism in the past, but that we weren't quite that extreme, at least not as a whole for my church, the way I was growing up. But there was a lot of preaching against abortion, and you could tell it was a very taboo subject, and there was a lot of shame around it. Now, this whole study that we're doing today actually came about back in 2022. I was teaching a Sunday school class at the time, and we had just passed when the overturn of Roe versus Wade happened. And I was very big on getting our class to think outside of the box and to try to humanize other people and understand complex issues for what they really were. So I wanted to present this to the class and get them thinking about it from an actually biblical point of view and not just necessarily what they constantly heard from a pulpit. So to understand where we are on this issue today in America, you have to have at least a little bit of an understanding of Roe versus Wade. I think just about everyone has heard about this. Whether or not everyone understands what it actually was might be an entirely different story. Roe versus Wade is a Supreme Court case from 1973 that ruled women have a right to privacy that allows them to have an abortion without scrutiny. And this, mind you, was only for the first trimester. Within the first 3 months, a woman would be able to get an abortion without having any interference. In the second trimester, the states could determine certain restrictions. And then in the third trimester, it was generally going to be outlawed by most states. That was the standing of Roe v. Wade, and it was set around privacy. Now, the thing that not a lot of people realize is the Roe of Roe v. Wade was a made-up name. It's like John Doe, you had Jane Roe. And this was to protect the privacy of the actual woman involved, but it did not end up staying that way. In fact, we know the name of Jane Roe. It was Norma McCorvey, and she became quite the character in the abortion debate. I don't think most people realize this, but she became the plaintiff in this case because she became pregnant with her third child, and she wanted an abortion. Mind you, this was all the way back in 1969. But at the time, she was living in Texas, which had outlawed abortion except in cases to save a mother's life when medically necessary. So there were some lawyers who kind of jumped on this, and they decided to use her as the face of their crusade against the district attorney there, Henry Wade, the Wade of Roe versus Wade, to try to get Texas's laws regarding abortion changed. Now, obviously, they were eventually successful in that, but the whole thing dragged out so long that Norma did actually have that third child. She never had an abortion for the child that Roe versus Wade was about. In the years afterwards, she kind of just got swept up in this whole thing, and she became quite a vocal advocate for women's rights and bodily autonomy. But what not a lot of people have been told is that 20 years later, in the mid-90s, While McCorvey had actually published a whole autobiography on the issue and was still quite a vocal proponent of abortion, she was chased after by this guy named Flip Benham. And he was a pastor at a church that was very anti-abortion. In fact, he was the director of a group called Operation Rescue that was very vocally anti-abortion. And he just kind of chipped away at her over quite a while. And in 1995, she converted to evangelical Christianity, got baptized by Benham, stopped working at an abortion clinic, and then became very vocally outspoken against abortion. And that's where things really start to get crazy, because she became this poster child for anti-abortion groups. Evangelical Christianity went bonkers over her in the 90s and early 2000s. And she would talk about how she basically just got paraded around by these abortion advocate groups, and that she was kind of taken advantage of and just used for her story. Now, if you were to ask me about 5 years ago, I would have said that's pretty much where the story ended. When I was in college, I remember reading a book about this whole thing and how she became a Christian, this whole backstory to it that, you know, the liberals were trying to keep from you because they didn't want you to know that she had actually become a Christian, and all this crazy stuff, right? And it's just like, oh, what a shame that they treated her that way, and it's so great she became a Christian. But that's not actually where the story ends, because the reality is she was taken advantage of by evangelicalism just as much as the abortion advocacy groups took advantage of her. She never really fit in with a lot of evangelical Christianity. She was a bit of a crass woman. She was very vocal, very outspoken. She would just speak her mind, and it was not filtered in any way whatsoever. And it's so funny, funny isn't the right word, it's sad, but I guess ironic perhaps, that the same Christians that would get up in arms if somebody they knew spoke the way that Norma McCorvey would, they accepted that about her because of the slam dunk she was able to be for them, for their cause. They were willing to overlook things that they would go crazy about in other circumstances just because this was an ace up their sleeve here. But they were no better family to her than the group she had been a part of before. And Norma McCorvey passed away in February of 2017. On her deathbed, just before she passed, she said that all of her anti-abortion activism she had done with evangelical Christians over the years had been, quote, all an act. She said, quote, I was the big fish. I think it was a mutual thing. I took their money and they'd put me out in front of the cameras and tell me what to say. That's what I'd say. Nobody likes to talk about that. But Christians did Norma McCorvey dirty just as much as anybody else did, and honestly probably more. Rather than seeing her as a human being, a person with complex beliefs and experiences, Christians just used her as a gotcha in their argument against the other side. I realize there are some who will say she wasn't in her right mind when she was dying, and you know what? I tend to believe her. Because that's the way Christians can behave a lot of times. And it sucks. I wish that wasn't the case. So I have to be honest and say I've seen enough of Christian behavior to know that is 100% possible. And honestly, pretty probable that that's actually what happened. Remember, folks, here we go. I think this is the fourth time now. If you claim to be pro-life, you have to be for all life, not just using someone as a pawn in your argument to try to gotcha the other side. Regardless of which side of this debate you are on or what Norma McCorvey actually believed, Christianity failed Norma McCorvey. Let's be careful not to fail a whole nother generation of women here. And that brings us to today, because in 2022, the Supreme Court reversed the ruling of Roe versus Wade. Now, that does not mean that abortion is now illegal in the states. The ruling was actually that each individual state could determine the various legal intricacies of abortion. This is not a political podcast by any stretch, but since we have basically 50 mini countries within one country, the way a lot of laws work is that yes, there are federal regulations, but a lot of times the states get to determine specifics. So that's the way it worked here in this reversal of Roe versus Wade. So from the 1880s until 1973 in America, abortion was illegal. From 73 to 22, it was completely legal in the first trimester, up to the states in the second, and mostly outlawed in the third. As of 2022, it is completely up to the states in any portion of the pregnancy, any trimester. And at least as of a couple months ago, this is the most recent information I could find, 14 states have a total ban on abortion, where at no point in the pregnancy can you have an abortion. 26 states have partial regulations, and that varies from state to state, and 9 have no ban whatsoever. So that gets you up to date on the American political side of it. Let's talk now about life and personhood. Most of the discussion on both sides of this issue have just gone over the heads of the other side, and it tends to be extremely unproductive and just makes everyone mad. If someone believes abortion is murder, they are not going to be convinced it's okay, no matter what you say. And if they don't believe abortion is murder, they are not going to understand why people want to tell a woman what to do. So the discussion has to focus on whether or not the baby, the fetus, the entity inside the womb is alive in the same sense as a human life outside of the womb. That means the discussion has to go to when does life begin. Most evangelical Christians would say that life begins at conception, the moment when a man's sperm and a woman's egg combine. That's the only option I heard growing up, independent fundamental Baptist. But here's the rub, and I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit here, but I want to address this philosophically before I do biblically. So hang tight with me. We're going on a little bit of a detour that's going to get us back on track. Both the sperm and the egg are already living organisms before conception. Yet neither one is a person. Life does not start at conception. Both parts of a fetus, of a human embryo, are already alive. Yet neither one is human. When God breathed into humanity's nostrils the breath of life, life began thousands upon thousands of years ago. So the question isn't about the origin of life, as much as it should actually be the matter of personhood. At what point does a person become, well, a person? There's an article I've linked to in the show notes called Why Life Begins at Conception is Simply Not True. It's by James McGrath. I want to read you a nice chunk of this here. It's a little bit of a long quote, but I think it helps to get a point across, honestly, as well or probably better than I could say. So rather than trying to summarize it, I'm just going to give you what McGrath said here. If the individual cell is already a person, and here he's talking about an embryo, so you've had sperm and egg already connect. If the individual cell is already a person with whatever is meant by an individual soul, then that leads to all kinds of implications that no one who holds this view, the pro-life side, the pro-abolition of abortion side, would accept. He asks, do identical twins have a single soul between them? Are they in fact the same person? And you say, what the heck is he talking about? Well, just hang on here. He explains it. If someone gets married to an identical twin, are they married to their sibling as well? If they have sex with the sibling, is it not adultery because these are the same person? He goes on. Now you're probably shouting at the screen saying, of course these adults are not the same person. Don't be ridiculous. Good. I'm glad you agree that it's ridiculous. That is the point. You said that at conception, their human personhood began as a single cell, a single human life. If you don't believe that one person can split into two people, then you have to accept that at least one of these individuals, and more likely both, were not individual persons at the moment of conception, but it happened later. In other words, the most straightforward way of treating this example is to say that a fertilized cell has the potential to become one or more persons. Just a little side note here, in case no one is aware. What he's referring to is when twins form in the womb, it doesn't happen immediately. It takes a little bit of time. So there's a good portion where the only thing in the mother's womb is one embryo. So if life begins at conception, which is what a lot of Christians say, if personhood begins at conception, then what do you do when further on down the line, that now splits into two human beings? How do you parse that out? That's a question not a lot of people have considered. I'm going to continue with McGrath's quote. If you want to advocate for treating that potential for personhood in a morally respectful way, that's wonderful. The point is that it is not murder to prevent that which has the potential to become one or more human beings from doing so. If it were, then you'd have to be able to know that a single cell would become one or two or three individuals and treat the abortion as a double or triple homicide as appropriate. Once again, you'll probably say, that's ridiculous, and that's the point. Claiming that a fertilized human egg cell is not just a potential person or set of siblings, but a full-fledged person leads to all sorts of untenable consequences. I understand this is confusing and disconcerting. The moment of conception seems like the only place that provides a potentially clear-cut line to draw so that human persons can have their rights protected. The blurriness of human development, with the fertilized egg becoming one or more persons over a long process, is much more morally ambiguous. Alas, that is the reality of life. As an imperfect analogy, there is no obvious moment where one can say that every human person transitions from being a minor to being a responsible adult. Yet we need to make laws that take the ambiguity of human maturation and impose on it a standardization that cuts across the fact that some can probably vote responsibly before age 18, while others will be lacking maturity for some time after that. End quote. All right, how you feeling? That get you thinking from maybe a little bit of a different angle? All right, let's keep it going then, because we have to ask, where does personhood actually begin? We've already established that there is life even before conception, but where does personhood begin? Again, I think most Christians would likely point to conception, but there are others who believe that a woman is not pregnant until the embryo implants on the lining of the uterus, which is roughly 7 to 10 days after conception. Now, some people even look at it medically and say life begins around 6 to 7 weeks when you have a heartbeat. Others will say it's closer to 15 weeks, or at that point almost 4 months, when there is a more fully functioning nervous system and brain. And that's why you'll find some states outlaw abortion after either 7 or 15 weeks. And then there are some who will say that personhood does not begin until birth. Now, hold your horses here, because as heretical as I know this is going to sound, I need to say it because this is the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. You cannot prove biblically that life or personhood begins at conception. I want to say that one more time. You cannot prove biblically that either life or personhood begins at conception. I know, that flies in the face of everything you have ever heard preached. Me too. Believe me, I did not ever want to say that. I went about this study initially trying to prove what I already believed. And the more I dug in, the more I realized that we have misrepresented what God was trying to communicate in His Word. Now, if you are getting ready to pick up those stoning stones again, just hold on, take a deep breath, come along with me, and let's examine what the Bible actually has for us on this matter. Conception is when sperm and egg meet. The Bible does not talk about sperm and egg meeting because it's not a science textbook. That's not how the ancients usually thought of reproduction. There is no Bible verse that specifically says life begins at conception. And that's because that's not the way they thought of it. In fact, you can see this in Hebrews chapter 7, where the author of Hebrews, whoever he may have been, was saying that Levi, whose descendants would become the priestly tribe in ancient Israel, and Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek through his forefather Abraham, and the verse says, because he was still in the loins of his forefather Abraham when Melchizedek met him. Now, the whole thing of Melchizedek and Abraham together, that's a whole other issue for another day. But Levi was not even Abraham's kid. He was Abraham's, great-grandkid at that point, I think? Because you have Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had Levi. So what's that? Great-grandson. Yeah. So he wasn't even Abraham's son. He was Abraham's great-grandson. And the biblical author, the Bible, is saying he was in the loins of Abraham, right? The ancient mindset was essentially that a person was entirely in the male sperm. A woman did not bring anything to the baby-making process aside from pretty much just being a greenhouse for the child to develop in. That was the ancient mindset. That was the mindset of the Bible, of the biblical authors. So you're not going to find anything about conception because that's not what was in their mind. They didn't have any idea of a male sperm having to connect to a female egg. It was basically the male sperm has everything in it and it just needs the woman's body to be there for 9 months and carry this thing. So you will not find any Bible verse that says life begins at conception. And the verses we frequently use to defend that position simply talk about God's forming a child in the womb at some undisclosed time after conception. That's the case in Psalm 139, 13-16, Jeremiah 1:5, Job 31:15, and many others. And we're going to get into a lot of those in just a second here. They do talk about God's activity before birth, but it's also after conception. This is where we have to be very careful to read the text for what it is saying, not for what we want it to say. Biblically speaking, I am going to tick some people off here, but biblically speaking, life begins when outside air enters the lungs. Genesis 2:7 reads that when God breathed the breath of life into man's lungs, the human became a living soul. I know this is so counter to how we think, but within a biblical mindset, anything that does not breathe outside air, particularly through lungs, is not alive. So all those Nat Geo documentaries that talk about life and then they show clips of plants sprouting and trees blowing in the wind, that's not actual life according to the Bible. Biblically speaking, plants are not alive. If they are, you have to believe that there was death before the fall, since Adam and Eve would have eaten plants and killed them in that process. Now, again, the Bible is not a science textbook, so that doesn't mean that you have to stop saying plant life or stop thinking of plants as alive. It's a helpful category. But within the Bible's framework, plants aren't alive. The breath of life is equated with having a soul, and that is what separates plants from animals. And note this, too, I'm really going to step on some toes here. Genesis 1:24 uses the same living soul term for animals that Genesis 2:7 does for humans. Now, depending on your English translation, it might not show, but it is the same Hebrew words. So if you have ever heard a preacher say that animals don't have a soul, well, that's not actually biblically correct. The breath of life is equivalent to having a soul. And what separates plants from animals is the breath of life, or a soul, because animals, according to the Bible, have a soul. They are alive. They are breathing outside air. Then it is the image of God that is what separates humans from animals. So, biblically speaking, life begins when a being begins to breathe outside air. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record here, the Bible is not a science textbook. It is not trying to prove a point about abortion. That's not its purpose. It can speak into those topics, sure, but that's not its main goal. So this does not mean that you have to be automatically okay with abortion. It does mean, though, that you should rethink how you use these Bible verses in light of what they are actually saying. If you walk away from our study here today and you believe that life begins at conception and abortion is always wrong, okay, that's fine. But you need to know why, and you need to be careful not to make the Bible say what it doesn't. And this is a very appropriate point to bring up again. Listen to the other side and hear what they are actually saying before you yell at a straw man that your side built up to argue with. If life does not begin at conception, at least not biblically speaking, then so much of the argument of conservative Christians goes out the window. And that is the perfect time to start to humanize the other side and realize that maybe we are not mortal enemies as we wage war against a bunch of unrighteous baby killers. It's not that simple. And I realize you can bring in all different angles to this. We can speak medically and philosophically, but right now I'm just concerned about biblically speaking, because that's my area of expertise. That's what I want to talk about today. Yes, you can bring in a medical argument. Yes, you can bring in a philosophical argument, ethical arguments, all of that. But biblically speaking, you cannot accurately say life begins at conception. It begins when outside air is breathed into the lungs. Another really good and provocative example of that is Ezekiel 37. And this is the famous Valley of Dry Bones vision that Ezekiel had. I want to read a handful of verses here. And this is not about abortion, so I don't want to make the same mistake that I'm preaching against here. Please realize, Ezekiel was not writing this with abortion in mind or 21st century American issues at mind. But I think it does speak into the issue because it comes back to this matter of when does life and personhood begin. Here's Ezekiel 37, starting in verse 1. The hand of Yahweh was upon me, and he carried me out by the Spirit of Yahweh, set me down in the midst of a valley that was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about. And, well, I looked, and very many were in the open valley, and look, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? Oh my word, the whole Son of Man thing, and then when you realize that was actually Jesus' favorite term to use of himself, such a rabbit hole that we have to sidestep right now. Ezekiel answered, Master Yahweh, you know if they can or not. Again, he says to me, prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. So says the Master Yahweh to these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you. Get it? And ye shall live. And I will put tendons on you, and I will bring up skin on you, and I will cover you with skin, and put breath in you. Here we go again. And you will live, and you will know that I am Yahweh. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I looked, the tendons and skin came up on them, and the skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Oh my word, this would make the most amazing horror movie. Just a side thought there. Don't get so lost in the fact that this is a Bible story that you miss the utterly horrifying image of a bunch of dead people's bones forming a skeleton army. Okay, this is extremely freaky. Back to verse 9. He, that is God, said to me, Prophesy to the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus says Master Yahweh, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Again, this was not written to address abortion, but can you see what this brings to our discussion? These bones were not considered alive, even when they were fully formed adults, until they were breathing outside air through their lungs again. It can be tough to wrap our minds around, especially when that's not the message we've heard. I know, but we have to move on to some other verses here and view this through the lens of other passages of Scripture. So let's look at some more Bible verses now. Next verse we have to look at, this is one that gets pulled all the time to use as an anti-abortion verse, and it's Jeremiah 1:5, where God says to Jeremiah, Before I formed you in the belly, I knew you, and before you came forth out of the womb, I sanctified you and ordained you a prophet to the nations. And so preachers will say, aha, see, it says, before I formed you in the belly, I knew you. So that means that he was a person, he was Jeremiah while still in the womb. Okay, I get the point they're trying to make, but that is not what the verse says. And this is a great example of how we read our own assumptions into these texts, and we think, oh, obviously it says this because that's what must be the one thing to believe. Like, obviously God is very anti-abortion, and so he's going to say that he knew Jeremiah in the womb there. But the verse doesn't say that. Look at it again. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. What does before mean? I'll give you a hint. It does not mean while. It means before. Here's where we see the assumptions start to show their true form. If God meant to say, oh, you were a person there in the womb and at conception you became Jeremiah, he would have said, while you were in the womb, or when you were conceived, I knew you. But that's not what God said. He said before. That is pre-conception. So if you want to take this literally as some statement about personhood or life or abortion, then that means that you have to be saying people are persons even before conception. How exactly does that work? Is it in the sperm? Is it in the egg? Is it half of a person in one and the other half in another? Is the person part of them waiting up in heaven to become a person one day? You see how ridiculous this is. God did not say, when you were formed in the womb, I knew you. He said, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. So that is suggesting personhood even before conception. I don't think that we have to take that as scientific fact just because it's in the Bible. Because, again, the Bible is not a scientific textbook and is not trying to tell us something about abortion or where life begins here. And really, even if he said, when I formed you in the womb, he's only talking about Jeremiah here. The very fact that God is saying this almost makes it out to be like Jeremiah is an exception to the rule. These statements would surprise him. That is the whole point of God saying them. We're not meant to generalize this. And if you take this to be anti-abortion, that then means you should also be anti-contraceptives and anti-anyone who isn't constantly trying to make a baby. If people are people even before conception, and we should give every life a chance, as a lot of pro-abolition of abortion people say, then that would mean that every possible life ever is a life that needs to be had. So then all forms of contraception are wrong. Using condoms are wrong. Not having sex every single time that you possibly can is wrong. Do you see how ridiculous that is? It just keeps getting more unhinged the further down the rabbit hole we go. Let's look at Psalm 139, starting in verse 13. For you possessed my reins, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there were none of them. I heard this one used a lot as an anti-abortion verse, saying, see, all babies are fearfully and wonderfully made, even when it's in secret, even when it's in the womb, even when none of the body parts are there yet, God knows it and is creating the child. But you know what was conveniently left off of any of those sermons? How about the second part of verse 15? When I was curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. You ever hear that one preached on? Yeah, me either. See, this isn't an anti-abortion verse. There's no mention of the womb in these verses. Rather, the child is said to be formed in the lowest parts of the earth. This is not, here we go again, a science textbook. This is not trying to make some statement on when life begins or the personhood of a prenate in the womb. This is actually making a theological statement, mimicking the creation from formless chaos into formed order. So it's almost comparing this prenate in the womb to the chaotic, formless, and void, tohu vavohu, wild and wasteness of creation before God created. Next up is Job 31:15. Did not he that made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? Here we go with assumptions again. We are so quick to read an abortion or anti-abortion mindset into this verse that we totally miss what it's saying. There is nothing in that verse that talks about conception or when life begins. Did not he that make me in the womb make him? Okay, well, at what point in the pregnancy is that talking about? We've got 9 months to work with there, and it doesn't specify, because that's not what it's interested in talking about. And furthermore, God made other things that we don't mind killing. God made animals too in that same mindset, so that doesn't really equate there. And also, you're not going to get this in English translations because they pretty much all say, didn't one fashion us in the womb? But the literal rendering of the verse is actually, didn't he form us in one womb? And you're not going to see that because, well, that kind of doesn't make sense to us today. But it doesn't have to. This is ancient Near Eastern poetic dialogue. We're not looking for scientific accuracy. Sometimes Genesis 1:27 will get thrown into the mix. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And preachers will say, see, God created every life in his image. Every child deserves a chance because they are the image of God. Hopefully by now you can see some of the problems with saying that, because we are making so many assumptions about this verse. This verse has nothing to do with pregnancy, with babies. It is talking about fully formed adult humans that God created. That was a one-time thing. None of us are created fully formed humans, so we should be careful using that to talk about every human life in the first place. But it's just an entirely different set of circumstances. This verse is talking very specifically about the first humans. And to then read into it something about pregnancy is completely yanking this out of context and missing the beauty of the story Genesis 1 is actually trying to tell. Luke 1:41 is another verse that gets pulled into this a bit. And this is before the nativity scene. This is when Mary finds out she's pregnant. She goes to her relative Elizabeth. A lot of translations will say cousin Elizabeth. The word is actually relative, so we don't entirely know what their relationship was. Could have been cousin, but we don't know that for sure. And verse 41 reads, "It came to pass that when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary," oh, and I should mention this first, Elizabeth is already pregnant with John the Baptizer. So when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe, John, leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Ghost. You can probably imagine where this is going. Anti-abortion preachers will jump on this and say, see, life in the womb, the baby moved. Okay, but let's actually stop and think about this for a second. That's not what this is talking about. It is a really strange story that an unborn baby in the womb could somehow sense the presence of another unborn baby whose mother had just entered the room. This isn't normal baby kicks, right? This is some strange force power where John was able to sense Jesus in another womb as soon as Mary walks into the house. All we're told is that Elizabeth heard Mary come in, then John leaped. And in our rush to make some point about abortion over this, we miss the incredible theology that is being done here. See, that word leaped, it's the Greek word skirtao, and it only shows up 3 times in the New Testament, all in Luke, 2 of the 3 happening here in this passage. But it does show up in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Tanakh. And that helps to shed some light on what exactly is going on here. See, the first use of the Greek term in the Septuagint is in Genesis 25:22, of the 2 twins struggling in Rebekah's womb, so Jacob and Esau. Apparently, it's used of just pretty normal baby kicks. But the real, I'm sorry, I have to say it, the real kicker, I told you it was going to be bad, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. The real kicker of this is Malachi 4:2. Let's look at that real fast. "But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise, with healing in its wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall." Now, what the King James translates there as grow up as calves, the Septuagint translates as leap like calves. So Malachi reads, when the righteous Son, and that's S-U-N, not S-O-N, by the way. I know there's been a whole history of people trying to read Jesus into that. It's the Son, S-U-N, not the Son, S-O-N. "When the righteous Son arises with healing in its wings, those who love Yahweh will frisk around like baby cows in a field." Just 3 verses later, mind you, Malachi then mentions the return of Elijah the prophet in the days when all this would happen. So Luke is doing some crazy, bonkers deep biblical theology, and he's drawing upon this passage in Malachi to suggest that the unborn John will embody the return of Elijah, and that when the righteous Son arose with the advent of the Messiah, that very baby who would grow up to love Yahweh started frisking about in his mother's womb. Do you see the incredible craftsmanship that Luke had here, where he's drawing on this word picture in Malachi and using it of John to say that Jesus is bringing about this new, renewed kingdom of God that Malachi had prophesied? Oh, folks, this is what we lose when we rush to use the Bible to defend our own preconceived positions, and we don't just let it speak for itself. Oh, there is so much beauty in these texts. They are so well written. They are literary works of art. And I wish we could just do a whole thing on that passage. I mean, that's what our normal podcast is about. Usually we just go verse by verse through passages, focusing on that sort of thing. But not today. So, unfortunately, I have to set all that aside and get back to the topic at hand. This passage should not be used as an anti-abortion clobber passage because, number one, non-human entities are often anthropomorphized in Scripture. So if you're saying, well, John moved there in the womb, the prenate in the womb moved, so obviously that's, a full person. Well, Non-human entities are anthropomorphized in Scripture. Trees, rocks, etc. are given human qualities. So just because something has a human quality in the Bible does not automatically mean it's human. I am not trying to say that prenates are equivalent to trees or rocks. I'm just saying that just because something has human characteristics in the Bible does not automatically make it human. So that argument is not sound. It's not going to get you where you want to go. Secondly, what's happening here is a miracle and not something that happens with every child. Not every unborn child has force powers to sense the presence of another unborn child nearby. It's a weird story. How are we feeling right now? I realize this has already gotten pretty deep and it's a heck of a lot to think about. We're not out of the weeds yet. We've got some more verses we want to look at, so let's just take a pause for a second, breathe, get up, stretch, get some water if you need to, and we'll come back in just a second with some more verses that we have to consider. Most of the other go-to Bible verses in this debate are about murder. And they'll be like Genesis 9, 5 through 6, after Noah got off the ark, Leviticus 24, 17, Exodus 20, 13, Proverbs 6, 16 and 19, and others. But those verses only count if you believe the prenate in the womb to be alive as a complete human being. Pro-choice advocates, or as we've been terming them, anti-abolition advocates, do not. So they will see you arguing about murder to be irrelevant. And if we consider, again, just from a biblical perspective, I realize you can come at it differently from other angles, but just from within the Bible's perspective, life does not begin until outside air is being breathed through the lungs. So if that is the point where life or personhood begins, then saying abortion is murder and using verses saying thou shalt not murder or anything like that regarding abortion are going to be irrelevant to the discussion. Now, I realize it brings up other questions of what exactly is the nature of the prenate, because it is still human, but what is it? And that's where the difference between life and personhood has to come into play. And that and 100 other questions are really important questions that need to be addressed from philosophical and ethical angles. But again, that's not the focus of our podcast today. We're just focusing on the biblical side of it. So if you're thinking through all of those questions, or heck, maybe this is just so overwhelming, your brain is fried at this point, I get it. But I'm just trying to come at this from a biblical standpoint, where if we have to say, based on the Bible, that personhood and life begin at birth, then all of the verses that we use to talk about murder being wrong and then equating that with abortion, they do not apply to this situation. Exodus 20 and Genesis 9 are pretty obvious on that count. Proverbs 6 falls into the same thing. This is verse 16. These 6 things does Yahweh hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, and then it goes on for a couple more verses. And the part that's always focused on is the hands that shed innocent blood, and they're like, ha, it's talking about abortion. No, that's not talking about abortion. That's talking about murder. That's talking about somebody killing another human being that didn't deserve it, that had nothing to do with the situation. And since the Bible does not define life and personhood as beginning until birth, using this sort of verse to describe abortion is dishonest to the biblical text. Now, the same problem occurs when we use verses about children being a blessing or being innocent, like Matthew 18:14 gets pulled in sometimes. It's not the will of your Father which is in heaven that even one of these should perish. And then similar verses would be brought in about, if you cause even one of these little ones to stumble, it'd be better that a millstone be wrapped around your neck. And, those passages are a whole other discussion for another day. But I also want to point out that when Jesus used the term little ones, he wasn't always just referring to children. He actually used it as a term of endearment for his followers. So when he said, any of you that cause one of these little ones to stumble, he wasn't just talking about kids. He was talking about his followers in general. When you are causing offense to another person, that is like dragging them down and drowning them. And so Jesus uses this very disturbing image and saying, imagine that for yourself. And that's like what you're doing here. But again, this has nothing to do with the discussion on abortion. I've also heard Psalm 127:3 brought into this. Children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Again, though, this isn't talking about prenates. It's talking about children already outside of the womb. The fruit of the womb is something that has already been harvested, if you will. The mother has already given birth. We have to be so careful to respect the Bible and not take these verses out of their context. And there's so many others that we could focus on. I mean, when the psalmist said, "You formed me in my mother's womb," he wasn't thinking about an ethics debate that people would be having 3,000 years into the future. He was just using flowery dialogue to praise God for being sovereign, loving, and gracious. We must be cautious not to import into the text our modern-day assumptions based on what we hear or have heard preached. These verses meant something for 3,000 years before we brought out our own context into them. So let's be careful to respect that. There are definitely other verses that get used in abortion discussion, and we could just go on for hours more talking about that. But I think what we have addressed so far in these verses pretty well covers the categories that any of those verses are going to fall into. And believe it or not, there are even a couple passages in the Bible that can be read as pro-abortion. So we're going to get into those next. Here's where it starts to get really weird, so strap in. We're going to start in Exodus 21, verse 22. "If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit departs from her, and yet no mischief follows, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." So believe it or not, this is actually where the whole eye for eye, tooth for tooth thing comes from in the Bible. And here's what's going on, because I realize this is a very strange passage. The law given states that if a pregnant woman gets involved in a fight, is struck in the stomach, and then and this is worded weirdly, so I'm going to keep it worded weirdly, because this is where translation can sometimes get in the way, and it tries to smooth out a strange passage, and it just kind of makes us miss what's going on. It literally says that her child goes out from her. Okay, so we'll talk about what that means in a second, but just hang on to the idea. She's involved in a fight, she gets hit in the stomach, her child goes out from her, but then it says no mischief happens. And there's a whole debate around what exactly that means. Literally, the word is for a fatal incident. So let's backtrack for a second. Pregnant woman, involved in a fight, struck in the stomach, her child leaves her, but no fatality happens. Then the husband gets to decide the punishment for the man who struck her. But if a fatal accident happens, then the man who struck her has to be killed. Here's where the difficulty comes in. What does it mean for the child to leave her? Does that mean that she miscarries, or does that mean that she gives birth prematurely? And who is the unfortunate recipient of the fatal accident? Is it the prematurely born child, or is it the mother? So one situation of this is pregnant woman involved in a fight, she gets hit, she miscarries, but she's okay, versus she miscarries and she dies in the process. Second option is pregnant woman involved in a fight, hit in the stomach. She is forced to go into early labor, early delivery, and either she survives or doesn't. If she survives, then the husband just determines some penalty, which the whole patriarchal thing going on here, and the fact that she doesn't get a voice herself is a whole other topic for another day. But that's one option, and then the other is if she dies, then the offending party has to be put to death as well. If it's the first option, where she miscarries or she dies, that would seem to imply a difference in life inside versus outside of the womb, where the loss of the prenate just leads to a fine versus the loss of the mother leads to death penalty. I know that's a lot, especially when you're just listening to it, so I'll try to lay that out in the notes as well for this episode so you can read through it a little bit more. And that's a very uncomfortable reality to sit with, if that's what the verse means. I want to give you a couple quotes now from Dania Ruttenberg, and she kind of helps to explain this difficult passage. She says, "This idea is underscored in the Talmud, a collection of statements from ancient rabbis. One declares that for the first 40 days of pregnancy, a fetus is, quote, merely water. Essentially, it has no legal status at all. From the end of the 40-day period until the end of the pregnancy, it's regarded as part of the pregnant person's body, as is the mother's thigh, the Talmud says. Here again, the fetus is secondary to the adult human carrying it. This becomes most clear when a pregnancy or labor endangers the pregnant person. According to a roughly 2,000-year-old source called the Mishnah, the core of the Talmud, abortion is explicitly called for to save their life. The life of the baby comes into consideration only once the head has emerged. But beyond life or death situations, Jewish law permits abortion in situations where carrying the fetus to term would cause, quote, woe. And that includes risk to mental health or to kavod habirot, which is dignity. Abortion access, then, is a matter of religious freedom. Jews are permitted to terminate a pregnancy, and when our lives are at stake, we may be obligated by Jewish law to do so. End quote. Here's from her other article. In the mid-3rd century BC, the Hebrew Bible began to be translated into Greek, into what became known as the Septuagint. There, ason, the word for harm, damage, or disaster, and that's the word translated as mischief in the King James, was translated as ex ikonismenon, which literally translated as from the image, which is, needless to say, not a good or useful way to communicate the meaning of that word. Theories abound as to why this happened, like the claim by Richard Freund, a scholar of Hellenistic Judaism, that the translators got stuck on the similarities between ason and the Greek word soma, meaning human life, and tried to communicate something about being created in God's image. For whatever reason, in the Septuagint's translation, the meaning of these verses was completely transformed. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but it is not in the form, the one responsible shall be fined when the woman's husband demands compensation. The payment will be determined by judges. But if it is in the form, the penalty shall be life for life. That's how the Septuagint translates it. Theology based on that translation soon followed. It's easy to see how St. Augustine, working out of the Septuagint, could develop his theory of ensoulment from here. A fetus early in formation, or in the early steps of gestation, did not have a soul, and thus it was not considered manslaughter to cause its accidental miscarriage. A fetus that was more formed did have a soul, so a person who caused its miscarriage would be indeed liable as though they had killed a fully formed person. St. Thomas Aquinas, too, pointed to the moment of quickening, the moment at which fetal movement could be detected by the pregnant person, as the point of ensoulment. For both Augustine and Aquinas, abortion was always regarded as an offense against God, but after the point of ensoulment, it was regarded as much more so. The Catholic Church ultimately dropped its distinction between the fetus before and after quickening in 1869, coming down against all forms of abortion. So that's interesting. The Catholic Church is kind of infamous for being anti-abortion, even though many Catholics themselves are not. But that was not entirely the case until 1869. Going back to our quote, after Augustine's theories became widespread, a formal doctrine of abortion would be unlikely to become more permissive down the road. Despite that, some argue that both Augustine and Aquinas' notions of delayed hominization, delayed personhood, in essence, the notion that the soul doesn't drop in until quickening, makes room for a stance that allows for abortion. And in fact, it's worth recalling that most American Catholics believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, and a significant majority oppose overturning Roe v. Wade. This was written before 22. On the Protestant side of things, translation choices that were straightforward at one point seem less so as language has evolved. The King James Bible, the go-to version for many American Protestants, particularly in many evangelical and Baptist circles, decided to translate ason, presumably from the Hebrew rather than the Septuagint's Greek, as mischief. In the 1600s, this word did connote misfortune or calamity, but today the word choice simply obscures the verse's meaning. Someone reading this passage without any context might not be able to pick up on what the Hebrew, or indeed the original meaning of the King James's English, is actually describing. End quote. And this is a good point to mention as well, that there has been debate throughout both Jewish and Christian history as to abortion, when it's okay, if it's okay at all. Historically, many prominent Christian writers have been opposed to abortion. But what's really interesting, especially when you read some of the early church fathers and pre-Reformation times writers, is that they'll often speak of abortion right around the same area that they're speaking about sorcery or witchcraft or necromancy or anything like that. And it's a strange correlation that isn't usually commented on. Well, for one thing, people don't usually read those obscure works unless they're extremely nerdy. But I still have yet to really hear someone point out why those are the same thing. I think a lot of times it's because medicine in the ancient world was basically seen to be on par with witchcraft or sorcery. And having some sort of abortion prescribed to you at that time would have been like having a love potion prescribed to you at that time. It was kind of in the same realm of understanding because they just did not understand how medicine worked. I also want to note, after saying all that, that not all scholars actually agree with this understanding of Exodus chapter 21, with some attributing the difference in punishment to the lower social standing of children when compared to women. So even outside of the womb, once a child has been born, there was still a hierarchy of, I hate to say it this way, but human significance. Since the Bible was written in a patriarchal culture in the ancient Near East, men were given preeminence, and then women were seen as below them, and children below that. So just because there's the whole thing of a different punishment based on the prenate versus the woman, it could also just be that it's a child versus an adult. So this passage definitely gets us thinking, but I don't think we should go as far as saying it's pro-abortion. One other passage I want to look at here is Numbers chapter 5, and beginning in verse 11. This is definitely not one you're going to hear preached on this week in church. Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, if any man's wife go aside and commit a trespass against him, and a man lie with her carnally, and it be hid from the eyes of her husband, and be kept close, and she be defiled, and there be no witness against her, neither she be taken with the manner, and the spirit of jealousy come upon him, and he be jealous of his wife, and she be defiled, or if the spirit of jealousy come upon him, and he be jealous of his wife, and she be not defiled, then shall the man bring his wife to the priest, and shall bring her offering for her. The 10th part of an ephah of barley meal, he shall pour no oil upon it, nor put frankincense thereon, for it is an offering of jealousy, an offering of memorial, bringing iniquity to remembrance. And the priest will bring her near, and set her before Yahweh. The priest will take holy water in an earthen vessel, and of the dust as of the floor of the tabernacle the priest shall take, and put it into the water. The priest will then set the woman before Yahweh, and uncover her head, put the offering of the memorial in her hands, which is the jealousy offering, and the priest shall have his hand in the bitter water that causes the curse. If you're saying, what the heck is going on? Trust me, it's about to get even weirder. The priest shall charge her by an oath, and say unto the woman, if no man have lain with thee, and if thou hast not gone aside to uncleanness with another instead of thy husband, be thou free from this bitter water that causes the curse. But if thou hast gone aside to another instead of thy husband, and thou be defiled, some man have lain with thee beside thy husband. Then the priest shall charge the woman with an oath of cursing, and the priest shall say to the woman, Yahweh make thee a curse and an oath among your people, when Yahweh makes your thigh to rot and your belly to swell. And this water which causes the curse will go into your bowels to make your belly swell and your thigh rot, and the woman will say, Amen, Amen. And the priest shall write these curses in a book, and he shall blot them out with the bitter water. And it continues on for a few more verses there, but you get the idea. Or maybe you don't, because it is unlike anything that you probably read in a devotional, right? This is not your motivational verse of the day that's showing up on YouVersion. Now, what's going on here in this passage is you have a guy that thinks his wife cheated on him. Now, whether or not she did is irrelevant, because all that matters is he thinks she did. Again, patriarchal culture is a wonderful thing, right? So rather than, taking her word for it or anything like that, he has to take her to a priest. So he takes her to church, basically, goes to the pastor, if you will, he goes to the priest, and the whole way of determining her innocence or guilt in this, whether or not she actually slept with anyone else, is not a series of questions. It is not any kind of medical examination. It is not, interviewing witnesses and checking her texting history or anything like that. Nope, what the priest is supposed to do is get a bowl of water, put dirt in it from the floor, and make her drink it. And then, if she is innocent, nothing will happen to her. If she is guilty, well, that is quite the picture. It says her stomach will swell and her thigh will rot, or quite literally, her womb will drop out of her body. Again, very strange, all kinds of debate that has revolved around this passage. There are some who consider this to be a divinely caused abortion. And talking about her womb dropping out of her and her stomach distending, if she was pregnant because of this, that sounds like a loss of the pregnancy. And if this is done by the priest because God commanded it, that would be a divinely not only sanctioned but caused abortion. And you know what? That is actually a possible interpretation. But there are other ways of reading this as well. Since the result of her innocence is that she could have kids, if you read further down, it's saying that if she actually was innocent, she would be able to have children. Since that's the result of her innocence, some take it to mean that not that she would miscarry, but actually that she would become infertile. So if the result of being innocent is you can have children, maybe then in a parallelism, the result of being guilty would be infertility. There is no actual mention of pregnancy, just infidelity. So this could very well be about infertility rather than abortion. It's also worth noting that we have absolutely zero record of this ever being performed on anyone because this is disgusting. This is unsanitary. This is unscientific. There is absolutely no way of knowing that this would actually work. Like, sure, God said it would happen that way, but how? I mean, that's not even a miracle. That's like the opposite of a miracle. What was the line? I think it was from Nope. What do you call a bad miracle? Apparently this, because that's just really, really strange. I almost wonder, and this might be reading my modern mindset into it, but I almost wonder if God put it that way to assume the woman's innocence. Because drinking dirt water, I mean, it's not good for you, but it's also probably not going to cause your stomach to distend and your womb to drop out of you. That's just unheard of. And maybe that's the point. God put such a ridiculous thing as the test of infidelity, maybe to always give the woman there the benefit of the doubt, because maybe that never actually happened. Maybe even if that test were performed, it never yielded a positive result because it never could. That's not how drinking dirty water works. So, maybe God set it up that way just to always give the woman the benefit of the doubt. But, I mean, then you still have to deal with, that's a really strange way to do that, and she still would have had all kinds of shame and guilt around all that, so it's not the best thing. But that's getting down a whole rabbit hole. Regardless of how you interpret this verse, it is a very odd passage that was about specific cases for specific people in a specific place and time. And even then, we have no evidence of it ever actually happening. It's definitely not applicable for today. And just like with the anti-abortion verses that are used, there are other verses that sometimes get pulled in to sound like a pro-abortion position. But again, I think it kind of runs into the same issue where there's just so many differences of interpretation, these difficult passages, that I don't think we can say any of them are pro-abortion. Just like we said at the start, nobody is pro-abortion, and I don't think God is either. It's more about the argument of autonomy and taking care of the woman and personhood and when life starts and all this. So I don't think there are any pro-abortion verses in the Bible. But hopefully reading through all of these has helped you see that it's not as black and white as we thought it was. And it's not that the Bible just automatically supports one position or another. So now that we've gone through that, let's consider some thought experiments that might help us understand either side of this a little better. A lot of people who are pro-outlawing abortion don't really give room for exceptions. So a common question that comes up is, what if the mother is pregnant from rape? If you would say, yes, I would allow for an abortion in that case, would you punish an innocent child for the sins of the father in any other situation? Now, based on the conversation we've had already, whether or not the prenate in the womb is an innocent child in the same way as one outside the womb, it's fuzzy. But if you wouldn't allow the abortion, how would you deal with the mothers now having to go through a lifetime of seeing a daily reminder of what was probably the worst day of her life? And even if you allow for adoption, how do you help her wrestle with the next roughly 9 months and then all the pain that would still be there afterward? Pregnancy and childbirth is one of the hardest things the human body can experience. Forcing a girl to carry a baby and then go through painful childbirth is harsh if that's not what she wanted. And before I go any further, I need to take a second to stop here and just say, please do not ever say that forced rape doesn't lead to pregnancy. There are a disturbing number of Americans and a disturbing number of congressmen who have made statements that if a woman is truly raped and didn't have any part in enjoying it, which is so problematic in and of itself, it makes me want to scream. But they'll say that if a woman was truly raped and didn't enjoy it at all, had no part in it, then she cannot get pregnant off of that. Absolutely not. There is no evidence whatsoever for that. It is still sex. And what business do you have asking someone what their emotions were during a rape? Now, hopefully no one listening to this has ever said that. This is the sort of thing where I want to reach through a screen and punch someone if I ever hear that. It is one of the most insensitive, thoughtless things that you can say to another person. Sex is a pleasurable event. So even in a case of non-consensual sex, the body can still experience pleasure from that. And trying to then put some form of that as guilt on the woman for it is horrible and an absolutely monstrous thing to do. So please do not ever try to make some sort of statement about forced rape doesn't lead to pregnancy. It most certainly can. And you just make yourself sound like an absolute idiot if you say that. I usually try not to come across that harsh, but that's something I will be extremely harsh on. I also often heard that, well, the main problem here is promiscuity. If you wouldn't just have all these young people sleeping around in our culture today, you wouldn't have so many abortions. Okay, there have been people sleeping around as long as there have been people. All right, this is not something new. And it's not just horny, unwed teenagers that have abortions. What about married couples that have considered abortion? Again, what about rape? And you have to realize, too, that not all Christians view sex the exact same way. It's not quite that simple. People slept around before Roe v. Wade, too. They just either had very dangerous abortions, abandoned their child, or were forced into something that they weren't ready for. Even in marriage, consent to risk isn't the same thing as consent to consequences. Now, I'm, again, trying not to be super graphic here, but it's just kind of comes with the territory. Even if you have a married couple that's having sex, and let's say they're using a condom, there is always some risk that's not going to work, right? There is no form of contraceptive that is 100% reliable all the time. There's always that 1% or 0.001%, whatever. There is always a chance. There is always some risk. But acceptance of risk, consent to risk, is not the same thing as consent to consequences. Just because you consented to the risk that, yes, there is a minuscule chance that this might not work and we could get pregnant, that is not the same thing as consenting to the pregnancy itself. Think about it this way with me. There is risk in everything that we do. Every time you walk inside a building of any sort, you are accepting the risk that the building could collapse. Buildings collapse every day, and they collapse on people, and people get hurt. But people that get hurt in building collapses don't usually go, well, I walked in, so it's on me. No, they still sue the owner of the building for negligence. Just because you accepted the risk of walking into the building, that, mind you, was quite minuscule, does not mean that you were automatically accepting or consenting to the consequences should that risk turn out to not be in your favor. Why I heard so much is just, well, it's on them because they made the choice to have sex in the first place. So when you made the choice to have sex, you were making the choice to have a kid if that's what God wanted. But that's not how it works. Consent to risk is not the same thing as consent to consequences. You can consent to having sex without consenting to having a kid with that person. And realize I'm talking philosophically here. I'm not talking about the morality of sex with multiple partners or outside of marriage or with boyfriend, girlfriend, any of that stuff. I'm not talking about that. That's a whole other conversation for another day. I'm just talking philosophically here. And then let's consider too that an abortion is not the only moral decision here. Having a child is arguably an even bigger moral decision than having an abortion. Rebecca Peters, the same lady that came up with the term prenate for this discussion, has brought up this same point. She's even mentioned from stories that she's heard from other women that some women see abortion actually as an act of love for themselves, for the children that they already have or that they want to have in the future but aren't ready for, and for their family. We have to remember that we're not just talking about theoretical theology and philosophy here. We are talking about lives. And not just the life of the prenate, but the life of the mothers who have had abortions, the life of mothers who have lost children, the life of women who have struggled with fertility. This is a common enough issue that we can't just condemn it. And if you're a preacher listening to this, well, first off, thank you. I rail a lot on preachers because that's what I was trained to be. So, it's just kind of the mindset that I have. But if you are a preacher, please don't just condemn this. It's fine if you are anti-abortion. In a way, we all are. But don't just blanket condemn this. Consider the people in front of you. Consider the people who have had abortions in the past and kept it secret. Consider the people who have had abortions recently that you may not know about, or that are considering it because they're concerned about a pregnancy that maybe they weren't prepared for, or the ones who have struggled with fertility issues, or the ones who have lost children. You have to consider all of this. Being pro-life. Again, it's just such a politicized term. It can't just be about the life of this prenate. It has to be about life in general. It has to be about all these people. And having this whole mindset of, well, they had sex, so, they just have to have the kid now. Forcing someone to raise a child for the next 20 plus years and pour hundreds of thousands of dollars and thousands of hours of energy and everything into this, it's not an equivalent punishment to having sex outside of marriage. And for a side that's supposed to be pro-life, why would carrying and raising that child be seen as a consequence or punishment anyway? Aren't you supposed to be seeing it as a reward? Isn't a child supposed to be a blessing? So then wouldn't that mean that forcing that person to have the child is actually a reward for their wrong behavior? If children are such a blessing, shouldn't the punishment be taking the child away from them? You see, people just don't think that way. Their logic doesn't logic. They don't actually consider it beyond the point that it's useful for their arguments. But if you carry it out, it starts to get ridiculous. And then a whole other point of this that doesn't get brought up enough is, why do we focus so much on the mothers? Why are we doing legislation for women solely? Why is there no debate about legally forcing the father to stay around? There is so much patriarchy and misogyny that is still baked into our culture, where we just assume these things and where we put so much hardship on these women who are already facing hardship and not forcing the men to be accountable. To be consistently pro-life should be about more than just being anti-abortion. You have to care about the life, not just of the prenate, but of the parents and of the family, and even the life of the child after birth if they continue to have the baby. We're not fooling anyone here. It is usually the conservative side of politics that tends to be anti-abortion, and it is the more liberal side that tends to be in favor of just smaller regulations on abortions. It's so frustrating to me. I was going to say interesting, but you know what? It's not interesting. It's frustrating to me that these same conservative people, the circles that I grew up in, that are claiming to be pro-life and to care about life, are so consistently reducing other human beings into less than human creatures, calling people criminals, illegals, homeless, terrorists, pardon my French, but fat. Whatever the given term is, these are all ways of dehumanizing people, taking life away from human beings. And if you're so interested in life, why aren't you interested in the life that is already around you? The lives that we don't need to debate whether they have personhood yet or not. They have had personhood for decades, and yet you're dehumanizing them. And historically, these have been some of the same circles that have done forced sterilization on groups of people that they didn't agree with their lifestyle. These are historically the same people who have voted against care for new mothers. I understand there's all kinds of other issues that come into the political debate here, but if you are going to try to say you are pro-life, be for all life. Christianity, it's not about controlling other people. Evangelicals have a hard time trusting that someone will know what is the best choice for their own body. This is a natural result of being told week in and week out that you are a horrible, rotten sinner with a deceitful heart and you can't trust yourself. I realize there are all kinds of verses that get thrown in it. Trust me, those verses don't say what you're thinking they're saying. Even the heart is deceitful verse, that doesn't mean don't trust yourself at all. That's another episode for another day. But the Bible is not telling you don't trust yourself and constantly doubt everything about yourself. No, that is a damaging psychological message. And it's no wonder that when people hear that week in and week out, they won't trust that they will know what to do with their own bodies. Just because your pastor might be against one thing doesn't mean that that is automatically a bad thing for you to do. There is such a thing as Christian liberty. And if God is going to tell anyone what you should do, it's going to be you, because you're the one who should do it. That's not to say we don't need spiritual leaders or anything like that, but if you come from a Protestant evangelical tradition like I did, where we believe in the priesthood of the believer, we are direct contact with God at any point. We don't need some other human mediator to tell us what God wants us to do. We can determine that for ourselves. And this is something that a lot of conservative Christians really struggle to wrap their minds around. But it's biblical. It's the way of Jesus. Think about how many times Jesus asked his questioners questions. He didn't tell them what the answer was. He probed, and he got them to a point where they told him the answer, because he believed and trusted that they knew that deep down all along and just needed to bring it out of themselves. And if Jesus could trust people to know what was best for themselves and then to validate that, maybe we should as well. Now let's throw in another thought experiment here. What do you do in a case where the mother's life is at risk? I know some Christians who would say, well, we just need to trust God to providentially save one or both, and if not, well, that's his will, no matter how hard it is. That's nice and theological sounding on paper, but try telling someone that when they just lost their wife because they believed that their theology prohibited abortion in any case. That is not going to go over well. What if God's desire was actually to see the mother live so that she could have more babies? And you're able to be the way he does that by having an abortion. Now you say you're just getting too technical and playing mind games. Oh no, that happens. And what about, here we don't have time to get into this at all, but I'll just throw it in. Is it ever acceptable to have an abortion in cases where the child would be deformed or disabled? Is there a difference between a potential disability detected in the womb and one that exists in a life outside of the womb in how you would handle them? A lot of Christians tend to take for granted that every person wants to live and wishes that they had been born and are thankful for that. Well, as someone who has struggled with depression and suicide that I've talked about here on the podcast before, I can say that's not always the case. Now, I am thankful for the life that I have, and up until this point, I've been good at staying in it, but I've gotten to points before where that's not been the sentiment I've had. So not everybody has that same blanket love of life that is just kind of stereotyped. And along with this, I've often heard a thought experiment come up where someone will cite famous people who were almost aborted or might have been reasonably aborted given the circumstance. The illustration usually includes one of the Wesley brothers, Beethoven, Jesus, and then one other person that changes given the illustration. But even people who are opposed to abortion regulations, pro-choice camp, they too believe that every life deserves a chance. They're just arguing that the baby in the womb is not at the same level of personhood yet. So the pro-life argument, the pro-abortion regulation side, starts to sound like it's saying every potential life deserves a chance. But very, very, very few people would actually say that, because if you truly believed it, you would never use any form of contraceptive, and you'd be trying to have as many kids as possible. And at that point, it might as well be with as many partners as possible if every potential life deserves a chance. See, again, once we start to actually take this logic out to its logical conclusion, we realize it's not quite so logical. There's a man by the name of Adam Clark who's proposed this thought experiment. Imagine if you had a burning building where there were a whole bunch, like 100 frozen embryos, IVF sort of thing, right? Where the eggs are already fertilized. So you have this burning building, you have hundreds of frozen fertilized eggs there. But you see in another window, a couple of floors down, one child. Which do you save? And pretty much anyone in that situation is going to say, well, you save the kid. Well, those embryos are past the point of conception. So if you are taking the point that life begins at conception, you are choosing one child out of the womb versus 100 in another situation just because they haven't actually been born yet. You say, that's a ridiculous illustration. No, it's not. Because just 4 years ago, there was an incident in Alabama, an IVF facility, where several fertilized eggs were accidentally dropped and destroyed. And since Alabama has passed very strict anti-abortion laws, the Alabama Supreme Court actually ruled that those embryos could be considered children legally, and that then there would be a wrongful death suit because of this accident that happened in an IVF facility with a handful of fertilized eggs that were destroyed. This is why we have to be so careful with assuming that legislation is going to fix our issues. It sounds so nice and churchy and Christian and spiritual when you're fighting against abortion and trying to pass these anti-abortion laws, but this is the result of it. It ends up catching people in the crosshairs that have nothing to do with abortion. And if you think that's crazy, it's not the only story. There's another one I've put in the episode notes from an Ohio grand jury that tried a woman who miscarried for abuse of a corpse. She miscarried naturally. She didn't even have an abortion. It was a natural miscarriage, and she was forced to go on trial because of how strict the abortion laws are. Folks, please, please be careful. I know you want to see your Christian values played out in legislation, but this is what happens when we don't consider the ramifications of what we are fighting for. This is what happens. People get caught in the crosshairs when they have done absolutely nothing wrong, and it becomes so extreme, and then you've set a precedent for this kind of extremism to happen in other situations as well. We need to be so careful when it comes to thinking that we should pass anti-abortion legislation and think it's going to fix issues. More often than not, it's just going to cause more issues. And like I mentioned at the start of the episode too, statistically, it doesn't even really drop down the number of abortions. It just makes them far more dangerous. So they're already going to happen, and now you've just made it where women are going to be more likely at risk. Let me give you just a couple more thought experiments here to ponder, and we're getting toward the end. This one is a pretty well-known one. It's called the violinist argument, and it has different variations, but here's how I'm going to present it. Imagine that every time you go to the doctor, there is a small chance that you have to sign off on that your body could be used to preserve another person's life. 99 times out of 100, doesn't happen. You just have your normal doctor's visit and you're gone and there's no issues. But imagine you go this one time and you wake up and you are in a hospital bed, and connected to you by a whole bunch of tubes and wires and all that is a very famous violinist. This violinist has been hooked up to you because he has a fatal kidney disease, and without being able to use your kidneys, he is going to die. But if he is able to stay connected to your body, you can keep him alive. And let's just say, for the sake of the argument, if you are able to do that for 9 months, he will survive. If at any point before then you disconnect, he is going to die. What do you do? What should you do? Do you have any moral obligation to that guy? Sure, he's another human being, but he is sucking life and energy away from you for 9 months. And if we were really to press the analogy, let's say that he continued to need your support for the next 20 plus years of your life. You didn't consent to any of this. Now, sure, you consented to the risk that there is a 1 in 100 or more chance that this could potentially happen, by your going to the doctor, but you didn't actually consent to doing this. You didn't consent to the consequence of the risk. Are you morally required to help him? What about all the other people in your life that you're not able to do anything with in that time? What if you were a caregiver for, say, an elderly parent at that point, right? You can see how there are just so many complexities to this that it comes in, and I know it can start to sound ridiculous at this point, but I think it helps us to see that this has to be a nuanced discussion. There is no black and white answer to all of this. And the problem for pro-choice, for people who are anti-abortion regulations, it's not just the morality of abortion, but the morality of telling one particular gender what to do with their bodies. Nearly every law that we have is for all people. We've had to work at reforms in the last 100 years as we've learned that sometimes blacks and other minorities in America have been treated with a different standard in legal decisions. The law is supposed to apply equally. But this is an issue that mainly concerns people with wombs. And here's the thing that really gets me. The same people who push back against gun control because it sets a dangerous precedent of the government telling you what you can and can't do, they're the same ones who push for abortion bans. Is that not an equally or perhaps even more dangerous precedent that the government could tell women what they can or can't do with their bodies, more so than whether you can or can't own a firearm? Yeah, just look back a few years here. So many men pushed back against having to wear a mask during COVID and even said, "My body, my choice," in that year or two. Is not this a far greater issue? Like, I realize they were saying it to be ironic and to make a point about abortion, but that is actually kind of the point. Like, if you are trying to make this political statement about wearing a mask and the government telling you what you can or can't do there, that is kind of the issue with abortion too. I've heard several stories of very anti-abortion teenage girls who have had to consider an abortion because they knew Planned Parenthood would be more understanding and helpful than their family or church. And like I said at the start of the episode, the sad thing is a lot of the time they weren't even pregnant to begin with. That's just how bad the sex education is in so many evangelical homes. And it helps us to see, though, that Planned Parenthood isn't just a bunch of baby-killing monsters. People go to them because they have resources about family planning. People go into a Planned Parenthood a lot of times expecting all this stuff pushing for abortions, and what they realize is there's actually mostly just material about family planning and how to go about this smartly and in an informed manner in the future. Okay, I have been talking for way too long here. I mean, come on, for such a ridiculously complex issue, it is a miracle I squeezed all this into 2 hours. But I am sure you have more than enough to think about, and your brain is probably burnt out by this point. So let me just give a few final thoughts, and we'll wrap up. Considering everything that we have talked about here today, I just want to give some final thoughts for consideration. First, I heard a lot growing up, I can hold my nose and vote for whoever or do whatever in order to ban abortion. Like, that's the key. It's amazing to me how many Christians vote entirely based on the person's view on abortion, when that's not ever once given as a basis for a good person in the Bible. Ends justify the means manipulation is wrong. Even if you think you have a good cause, even if you come out of this study and you are still 100% anti-abortion, still in the fully pro-life camp, please at least don't be manipulating people the way that it's been done on both sides. Don't do what we did to Norma McCorvey. Our policy should not be hold our nose and vote so long as it's against abortion. Rise above that. If it means you lose some of the weight of your argument, then so be it, for the sake of honesty and integrity. Be careful how far you go. Consider the extremes of your position. Consider what is actually going to happen with legislation. Consider if this is going to affect people even just who have miscarriages. Are you forcing women into extended periods of pain and possibly even risking their health just to fit under a certain legal definition? You have to ask yourself, what will be the most loving thing and what will increase the most life? What does the most harm reduction? That's how Adam Clark put it. Which position is actually doing the most harm reduction? Will criminalizing this reduce harm? Will it increase life? Or will it actually just cause more issues? And this really comes down to the crux of the matter here, is this core question. Do you want to lower abortions or do you want to win? Because so many Christians are so focused on winning their argument that they don't care that if they win, it's not going to affect the number of abortions. Passing a legislation, arguing over people's heads over anti-abortion, pro-abortion, it's not getting anywhere. What we need is actual care for people in these situations. We're so busy shooting at each other that we're actually sometimes hitting innocents in the middle that really just need our care and support. Rob Schenck has said that we can't think people will leave their reality for our fantasy. We have to leave our fantasy for their reality. And remember, too, that using secular law to push religious beliefs is Christian nationalism, not American democracy. And here's my final thought for the day. The Bible is about empowering the disenfranchised. If your reading of it makes life harder on someone else, you're reading it wrong. Believe me, I am not some abortion advocate that just wants to see it all the time. No, I would love to see abortion rates go down significantly in our country, but that's not going to happen by legislation, because abortion isn't the real problem. The problem is that we have set up a culture in our American churches that won't even talk about sex, let alone unwanted pregnancy, except to preach against it. But what would happen if we as a community, and a faith community, made room for uncomfortable conversations about sex and pregnancy and birth control? I'm not saying you have to be okay with sex whenever, with whomever, but what if we said, sex is a gift from God? It's supposed to be awesome. But we also know that sometimes decisions are made for right or for wrong, and life doesn't always go according to the ideal. And if you end up in a situation with an unplanned pregnancy, outside of marriage or in marriage or whatever it might be, we're not going to kick you out of the church. And we're not going to look at you funny, and we're not going to make you feel awkward. We're not going to make you stand up in front of the church. We are here for you. We have resources for situations like this. Could you imagine a church with resources on abortion and family planning and adoption and all this, and not just don't abort, have the kid, or give it up for adoption? Like actual resources and care and trained counselors, not just pastors that want to push their opinions, but actually legitimately licensed and trained counselors who knew how to help with this sort of thing. Can you even imagine that? It is blowing my mind to think of a church that could be like that. And how sad that that's not the norm by now. It should be. We should be telling people, if you want to parent, we're ready and willing to equip you to be the best parent you can possibly be. And we have this incredible loving community that will help you however you want us to in the entirety of that process. And if you don't feel like you're ready to parent, that's okay too. We can walk with you through all the different options for that as well. We would rather help you continue to make wise choices than throw you out to the curb because of something you've done. We are always here for you. Oh man, could you imagine if that was the message churches gave instead of just a bunch of guilt and condemnation? Man, I think that if we could build up that culture, we would have far fewer conversations about abortion. All of this stuff that we've talked about, we wouldn't need to, because it would be far less of a problem. And since each of us is part of the body of Christ, even now, no matter what your local church context, whether you're in a position of authority there, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a Sunday school teacher, whether you're just somebody in the pew or Christian of any sort, you can start building that culture in your own circle of influence. It doesn't even have to be with other Christians. It can just be with people you know. Just be there. And if you're going to be pro-life, be pro-all life. See the person on the other side and start loving like Jesus. That will do more good for our churches, for our country. And you want to put all that aside just for the people next to us, beside us, every day. That will do more good for them than any amount of political posturing or legislation ever would. Thank you all for taking the time to come with us on this journey this week. We covered so much territory, and it was really heavy material. So please remember to take care of yourselves and take the time you need to process through this material. I'd also love to hear from you and learn what you think about this, where you were when we started the episode, where you are now. If you learned anything, if you think I left anything important out, just please remember to be polite and respectful. Like we said at the start of the episode, we can disagree and still be good Christians. But we want to be kind to everybody, regardless of whether they agree with us or not. Next week, we're going to Exodus. We're going to be hitting the 10 Commandments, reevaluating those in light of their ancient Near Eastern context and the rest of the Bible. And I can just tell you right now, at least 9 out of the 10 Commandments, I can guarantee you, do not mean what you think they mean. So I'm just going to leave you with that for right now, and we'll cover it next week. So until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.